Hey everyone, welcome to week 4. This is our first lecture this week, and we're shifting to look at the word research in the title of our course and talk about research methods that we'll be using to collect the data, analyze it, and prepare our final answers for our projects. We're going to be breaking this up into a few different methods where we'll talk about some of the key techniques that you may want to use to collect the information for your research, such as surveys, interviews, and a couple other types of techniques that may be helpful for you. Before we get into that, though, we're going to be talking a little bit more broadly about the research process, and that's the main topic for this first lecture of week 4. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover this week and next, they're kind of paired together as these two kind of main research process, research methods weeks. I'll be really using your proposals that you sent to me over the weekend as a way to get a sense of where you are with your project and tailor some of the material that I give to you. And you'll actually see that I'm going to take an example from one of your topic reports, your project proposals later in this lecture, and try to use some examples that can kind of connect the methods that we're learning to the work that you want to do, as well as writing some feedback for you on the actual documents that I'll give you hopefully within the next couple days, so that everyone will have some initial feedback on the plans for their research. It's a good time to keep reading the literature on your topic. Don't feel like you have to wait to read additional articles or get that next assignment where I'm saying, please give me some more literature. You can keep reading. You can keep finding material that is useful for your project and compiling that lit review that's going to be useful for your final paper and your presentation. We're going to have a couple of models that we'll read. So for example, this week I've asked you to look at this report that students did in this course a few semesters ago on administrative assistants at Colgate and the work that they do to make Colgate more sustainable. Then we have another one for class next week in week 5, where we're going to look at a survey that was done with the Upstate Institute to assess the effectiveness of their summer field school programs. So you'll get to see a good example of how you can develop a survey to answer kind of a community-based research question. It's okay to make initial contact with the key community partners who are identified in your project prompt. I wouldn't go too much further beyond that at this point with your research until we decide a little bit more about the actual question that you want to develop, as well as consider any IRB, Institutional Research Board, questions that we have, and I'll be covering that in a coming lecture so that you know a little bit more about the ethics and the institutional requirements that you have for doing research with human research partners for your projects. So as I said in class recently, I know that some of you probably have taken research methods courses before, and some of the things we cover may be a little bit of review for you. For other people, maybe less so. So I'm trying to give kind of a broad overview to start with before we get into some more of the nitty-gritty of the research methods that we'll be using. And overall, this diagram that you see here is kind of an overview of that research process. It's one that's probably familiar for you going maybe way back to high school or even junior high, when you learned about the scientific method and how scientists have a hypothesis that they want to test, and then they develop some experiments to test it and see what the results are and decide whether or not their hypothesis is confirmed or not. That's the basic idea of kind of the deductive scientific method. And this illustration here kind of shows more or less that process, especially in the context of a more social science approach to research. And it all really starts in this upper left-hand corner with a hypothesis sometimes, but more often we have a research question. It might not be necessarily in the form of a testable hypothesis that you can subject to an experiment. Sometimes it's broader than that, and its research question is really what we're focusing on in these early weeks of the semester. The preliminary proposal that I had you do is to kind of take your first cut at what a question might be, and then we're going to refine that over the next couple of weeks, so you really kind of sharpen it up and develop the methods and the results, the existing literature, the input from community partners that will help you to understand that. So really, this first box is where we're kind of starting off, and there's a couple of kind of bridging steps that we'll take between that question development and when you actually start to collect the data, probably around the midterm and the second half of the semester, and then moving into analysis. So that kind of bridge step, and one that we're going to talk about in more depth in this lecture today, and I really want to emphasize because I think it's a super important element of your research question and developing it, as well as choosing the research methods and the approaches that you want to use to collect your data, and that's conceptualization. So in other words, taking your question, putting it in the form of concepts, and then developing those concepts further so that you can work with them and do research with them. So overall, we're kind of starting broad, getting a little bit more specific and more precise, then even more specific and precise until we get to the point where we have a question that we can actually do research with. This conceptualization step is the kind of bridge that leads us from that broad to more specific. And overall here, just a couple of things to point out. We've actually talked before about this idea of dimensions without really fully defining it, but a good example here is a concept like, for example, sustainability. Broad concept, one that could potentially go in a lot of different directions, and we might say, well, how do we get a handle on this? How do we work with it? One way that we've done that in this course and in the literature is to break sustainability down into the 3 pillars: ecological, economic, and social. That takes this concept and makes it a lot more specific, or at least somewhat more specific, because we've got those pillars and we know, okay, now I've gotten a little bit better sense if I want to look at the economic pillar, that maybe I need to do some kind of economic analysis, and there's very specific research tools, although that's still a big area. Economics is a huge field of study, right? But at least it made it a little bit more specific, right? Then we can kind of go from there and to say, okay, are there subdimensions of those dimensions and sub-subdimensions? That's kind of the process that we want to go through to really develop the conceptual elements that are at the heart of our research question. And once we get to that point of really refining our concepts, we're essentially at the point where we have our variables. We're going to get into that a little bit more on the next slide. So I'll just finish up a little bit more detail about the research process, and then we'll talk more about concepts and variables for the rest of this lecture recording. So after we do the conceptualization process, we get to the point where we can actually really start thinking about doing our actual research. And I guess one thing to note here is that when we think about research, we usually think about how to collect data, the methods that we're going to use, how to conduct an interview, how to develop a survey, how to do the tests that we would have on, say, some quantitative or qualitative data. I guess the thing to emphasize here is that there's a bunch of steps that we have to go through before we can get to that point. And so research not only is that process of collecting the data, analyzing it, but getting ready to do that. And so that's why we kind of maybe, to belabor the point even more, we're doing all this extra stuff to get to the point where we can collect our data, because that's good research practice. That's a way to develop a question that's really sharp and that we can feel good about collecting data on and do it in an ethical way. So designing our method, operationalizing our variables, choosing the actual method that we want to use, and designing instruments like interview protocols or survey documents. Collecting the data, doing the sample. We're going to talk about this in the next lecture recording, how to think about sampling and actually collecting that data. Then data analysis, whole separate step, but it actually takes a good bit of time in addition to actually collecting the data, to do coding for qualitative data, to do statistical tests on quantitative data, and interpreting it all so that we get to the point where we can actually communicate it. And as those of you who have done research before have experienced, usually when you get to that result, where you have that conclusion, oftentimes it generates just as many questions as it answers, so that we start the whole process over again and collect more data to answer those questions. Regardless of the approach or the method that you use, it really all boils down to variables and the relationship between variables. So that's why I like to talk about how to set up your project in terms of variables and their relationship with each other. And most fundamentally, our research questions usually are about the relationship between some concept X and its impact on Y. That's the most simplistic way of thinking about it. It's usually too simple. Sometimes Y in turn has its own effects on X and so forth, but that's the kind of classic formulation of a scientific research question is, as X has some change, does it actually lead to a change in y? Where x we usually term as the independent variable, the one that's doing the changing and having some effect on the dependent variable y. And is there some connection there? If x goes up, does y go up? If x goes down, does y go up? And so there's an inverse relationship or a direct relationship, or one goes down and the other goes down. Overall, how can we put those two variables together and maybe even start to think about some other aspects of that question where there's more variables that might be affecting y, but we want to understand what those relationships are and find ways to assess them and measure them, whether it's with a more quantitative approach using numbers, using surveys, or in a qualitative method. We're always going to be kind of thinking about the relationship of those variables with each other. So here's where I can pull an example from one of your preliminary research proposals. This is a discussion of a piece of literature found by Lucy, Patrick, and Will for their project on how to assess the usage or lack of usage by low-income consumers of some of the energy programs that are available through New York State. They found this article by Vasileva and Campillo in 2014, and quote, they found that low-income consumers preferred to receive energy consumption feedback through letters and in-home displays. Consumers were motivated to save energy when money and environmental factors were involved, and they strived to reduce their electricity consumption and gain knowledge on how to maintain the low consumption, even though they were not interested in energy-related subjects. So in this description by Lucy, Patrick, and Will, they actually have embedded in here a bunch of variables as well as a relationship between a set of variables. So we can kind of put it in that same format, like they have it expressed in words here, but we can also express it just as kind of like a picture of the variables like we have in the top of the slide here of x arrow y, x having independent variable having some impact on y. So in this case, the dependent variable is energy conservation behaviors. What is it that influences people's willingness to focus on energy conservation or not? And so in this particular study that they found, monetary savings was a big factor, environmental beliefs, marketing, in other words, the flyers or other information that they got with their electricity bill or through other means, and then usage feedback, seeing how they save money by reducing their consumption. So all those factors together were important for shaping the energy consumption behaviors of the people, the consumers in this study. So it's another way of kind of trying to break down the variables. And especially if you're like me, you're kind of a visual learner, I like to just take a piece of paper and sketch some of these things out. Which are the independent? Which are the dependent? Which ones seem to be present in the literature? What do we hypothesize might be an impact that we want to maybe measure through our research? Those are important things to kind of sketch out and map so that we can develop the tools and instruments through surveys or through interviews or whatever method that we're using to try to get a sense of the relationship between those variables. One of the reasons that this process is really important is just because the sheer number of variables that we can consider in social science and environmental studies research projects is kind of overwhelming. There's a lot of different kinds of variables, and in some ways I think it helps to kind of categorize them and think about the different types of variables that we may want to consider in a research project. So some examples. Demographic variables. These are the things that are characteristics of people or households or institutions like Colgate or some other business or a government office. For a person, they can have things like an age, a gender, race and ethnicity, a class, family status, nationality, or citizenship. Those are all kind of characteristics that people either can gain in some particular way or that they oftentimes are just born with or ascribed by other people. You can't really choose your age. Gender you may be able to choose, but obviously there's a lot of kind of social constructions and social forces that determine those for people in their lives. So these demographic variables are kind of hard in a way and ones that we can use to kind of draw comparisons between different people and especially among groups of people. In addition to that, people can have various forms of capital that really matter in terms of who they are, what their chances are to achieve some goal, or the limitations that they might face in being able to set and achieve certain goals or get to certain stages in life. So one important one obviously is economic capital, like income or wealth, things like education or occupation, that give you status and prestige and credentials. Your location, where do you come from? Where do you live? And how does that matter? Status or prestige that may be associated with a certain title or a certain other aspect of who you are. Your health. The social networks you have can all be considered a form of capital as well, because we all know that who you know is just as important as what you know in a lot of cases. Then attitudes. These are a huge set of variables that are really often important factors, both as independent and dependent variables. Like, do you agree or disagree with certain types of statement? I'm sure you've all seen survey questions that ask you to agree or disagree with a statement. Your beliefs and ideologies, interests and stakes that you could have in things, institutions and your views on them, satisfaction or valuation, how much would you value in terms of economic value of something, or other values that you could ascribe to something. Those are all attitudes that we can measure and that might actually have important information for us about people's views on certain topics or certain actions that they could or couldn't take. But wait, there's even more. There's all kinds of structural variables, and these are kind of a little bit more conceptual, but things like culture, inequality, poverty, governance, public policy, technology, and sustainability are all big kind of structural, conceptual variables as well that we may want to measure and mix and match with these other ones. And then, of course, all the natural or physical variables that are important for environmental science and environmental studies, things like water quality or toxicity or things like that that are a little bit outside the bounds of social science research, but might still be really important to understand for a community-based research question. Even something like energy use, as in the case of the example I showed on the previous slide, that's something that we would measure as kind of a physical use of energy, but it has all these other kind of cultural, social, economic dimensions that shape that natural science phenomenon. So this is an exercise that you really want to go through for your own study. I asked you to get started on this in your preliminary proposal, but we'll keep talking about this and thinking about it and brainstorming about the key variables that are in your study and what's the relationship between them. What's independent? What's dependent? Are there potential confounding variables? In other words, variables that might actually exist outside of the relationship you thought was there, but are instead actually kind of pulling the strings in a particular research question that you have. What are the demographic, attitudinal, the other types of variables that we talked about? Can you think about the categories of variables that you might have? And where are your variables coming from? What ones can you find in the existing literature that you're reading? Are there ways that your community partners are giving you input about the variables that are most important for them and that they think are essential or desirable to study for your research? Those are all key questions to consider and ones that I hope we'll brainstorm together as we discuss your projects in class.